A warm welcome to everyone. It's lovely to be here. During my talk, I would like to draw your attention to the extensive post-excavation program that took place following the recovery of over 700 small finds from the wreck of the London. I will share some results with you and shall outline how close collaboration between a multidisciplinary project team can contribute to our understanding not only of this wreck, but also in the wider context to this period of naval history. The London is one of 54 wrecks protected under the Protection of Wrecks Act of 1973. It is situated in the Thames estuary, and we've just had this brilliant presentation from Mark, but I'm going to say it anyway, as you've seen on his slides, very closely situated to a busy shipping lane. This location puts the wreck at risk, which is indicated by shifting sediment levels and exposed artifacts. One way to combat the risk to an archaeological site is to deepen our knowledge about it. Historic England has been working alongside the licensing team, providing training and support for recoveries made by the wreck licensees. And in addition to that, Historic England has also funded 2 seasons of excavation. This dual approach, where a large amount of artifacts is being recovered over a short period of time during the excavations, and where a small amount of artifacts is being recovered from the site on an ongoing basis as part of the licensing agreement, has challenged our usual project management approach. So if we take a look at the usual project life cycle, this becomes clearer. We start off with recovery of finds and artifacts following on from dives and excavations. Artifacts recovered from the marine environment require immediate first aid care. During the excavation, this was achieved by the dive team, and the licensing team has received training to deliver first aid for finds themselves. Documentation is crucial throughout all project stages, but when you're working with 2 different systems of artifact recovery, it is really important that the methods used for recording and documentation are married up and match each other. We normally then cease to recover artifacts and move into the assessment phase. This is where you look more closely at everything that has been recovered to date and assess its potential to answer your research questions. But with the London project, we never really reached an endpoint, as the volunteer recoveries by the licensing team just kept coming. In the end, we decided to impose an artificial endpoint, where for the purpose of this project, we considered artifacts recovered before a certain date only. After assessment, we then move into the analysis phase, and this is when things really get interesting. Here we look at everything in much more detail. We may establish material compositions, we may identify raw materials, and this is where we collect more data related to the finds and interpret the results to tie them in with the wider site interpretation. Towards the end of a project, the archive will be deposited, in this case with Southend Museum Services. And depending on the size of a project, there might be a monograph or some sort of publication at the end, sharing the results. In some cases, there might be an exhibition. And yeah, for the London, we had obviously the exhibition in Southend already, but that was a temporary exhibition. But there's also the small contribution to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where 6 artifacts are on permanent display already. This has sort of, again, caused a bit of a challenging approach from a project management point of view. So anything that goes on display had to be fast-tracked in terms of analysis and conservation, but also in terms of photography and illustration, as these artifacts were not accessible for some time. So we had to ensure that those artifacts that were selected for display had all the tasks done to them that we needed, for the end of project publication, or we had to make sure that none of the specialists needed access to them to do their work. I mentioned project management quite a bit already, so this is quite a good time to mention the project managers for this project. We just heard from, the project managers for this project are Cotswold Archaeology. And the whole project team consisted of a myriad of different specialists to achieve the different objectives of this project. It is very important to recognize the individual needs and contributions to a project, and ensure that channels of communication remain open to agree schedules, but also to share any new information that comes about as you progress in your project, so that we can all learn from one another, but also that we make sure that we don't duplicate our efforts. Okay, so I put the slide up just to give you a very brief glimpse into the wide variety of different materials and artifacts and artifact groups that have been recovered from the London. And now we're going to start looking into the results a bit more. So the London and everything within were buried in silt for much of the past 355 years. And leather and wood items, which normally don't survive well on land sites, were beautifully preserved because of reduced oxygen levels. For me, one of the most exciting things to come across were the laces on the leather shoes. And you can see one example here in this image where I'm actually pointing to the lace that you can see here. Can be a bit challenging in archaeology. We often deal with different shades of brown, but your trained eye gets soon used to distinguishing the different textures that you have present on the artifacts. And this example that I'm pointing at here had one lace still in place, closing the shoe as it would have done when it was worn. And it's this level of contextual information that can tell you so much. Shoes in the 17th century were largely latchet style shoes, and some had decorative bows on them. So on this shoe here, you see we have 4 holes here in the tongue. 2 holes would hold the laces to close the shoe, and the other 2 holes could hold a decorative ribbon. And this is exactly what we have present on one of the shoes from the London. Without the lace connecting the latchet to the tongue, so the latchet are these little elongated leather strips that come round from the back and then to the side and then come to the front of you, and the lace goes through the holes of the latchets and then to 2 of the holes in the tongue. So if we didn't have that connection where the little lace, the ribbon that we found on the shoe was still present or was still connecting the latch to the tongue, the lace could have been interpreted as a rose, the decorative, often brightly colored ribbon that we know adorned some of the shoes at that time. The fiber identification for this project was undertaken by Margarita Gleber, and the lace in this shoe was made of silk, so quite a noble material. We also run dye analysis. However, this was inconclusive. We all had high hopes that it would come back with a brightly colored crimson big red color, but yeah, the dye analysis was inconclusive, so we can only speculate as to the colors of what the lace would have looked like. So when artifacts arrive in the lab after an excavation, we often start off with a program of X-radiography. These X-ray images will produce a record of the materials as found, and they will also help in identifications and any subsequent conservation work. Like this hammer, for example, where we used the X-rays and worked alongside the X-rays to remove the overlying concretion to reveal the shape of the artifact. In other cases, the X-rays reveal interesting details that are not easily visible to the naked eye, like this pewter spoon, for example, where the X-ray showed a touch mark and the initials BA. In his work, the find specialist Jörn Schuster established that the owner was a bachelor. As for a married man, you would expect to find 3 letters consisting of first name initials of the couple at the bottom and the last name initial at the top, all arranged in a triangle. And because we only have 2 letters present on this spoon, he concluded that it must have belonged to a bachelor. And again, it's quite fascinating, this sort of level of detail you can get into the inside of personal possessions. Some of the more unusual recoveries from the London included 5 candle fragments. And although light would have played a huge role on any ship of this size, mainly obviously to illuminate the lower decks, we do sometimes find lanterns, but the actual medium creating the light is strangely scarce from the archaeological record. The candle fragments were analyzed using an infrared spectrometer, and this established that they were made of beeswax, which gives a much cleaner and less smelly flame compared to tallow. Here is an example where we collaborated closely with our material science colleagues. When cleaning one of the leather book covers, I noticed different colored patches. And this was investigated using a non-destructive method of chemical analysis called XRF, which stands for X-ray fluorescence. So here you can see the book cover, and on the edge, which I've enlarged here, you can see what we suspected were remains of gilding. So these are the sort of lighter yellowish patches there. And they were very, very small, very few remains only. Amazingly, though, the underside of this book cover, so that is the inside, showed some red staining under the turn-ins. Those are the flaps that hold the boards in place. XRF analysis confirmed that areas of gold and some red paint survived on this leather book cover, showing that it originally was an elaborate and costly item. So here we've got a screenshot of what the XRF analysis looks like, and you on the sort of microscope picture here on the left, you can see the remains of the gilding a bit better. The red paint was the mercury-based pigment vermilion, and vermilion was a very expensive pigment, so it was often mixed with cheaper materials, and in this case it had been mixed with red lead oxide. Amazingly, some remains of the board also survived. The boards were not made of wood, but of cardboard, and the fibers of this cardboard were very poorly preserved, but could be distinguished as a bast fiber. So taking all these findings from just one artifact, this really demonstrates that despite the site being at risk, the level of preservation for materials such as pigments and paper are extremely good actually. Here, I would like to draw your attention to the work of my colleague Sarah Painter, a material scientist who, among other things, has looked at the material composition of various glass objects from this wreck. A closely dated assemblage like from the London can consolidate and further refine our knowledge on changes in glass composition throughout time. But it can also tell us where glass was produced, and this gives insight into trade and exchange. In the mid-17th century, when the London was lost, most windows and bottles were made of common green glass, and you can see examples of that at the bottom of this slide here. Colorless glass was reserved for selected objects, like the best drinking glasses, for examples, or lenses and mirrors. Remarkable survivals from the London include several examples. A small pocket sundial contained a colorless glass lens, which still magnifies today, and this is this piece here. And also a rectangle of colorless plate glass with a beveled edge, and you can just about make out this line here. This indicates the beveled edge where the thickness of the glass reduces towards the edge, so it gets thinner on the outer edges. And Sarah concluded that this flat piece of glass may have come from a mirror that has now lost its metal coating. One of the largest material groups recovered from the London was wood. My colleague Zoe Hazel, together with Emma Atkin from Cotswold Archaeology, undertook a large program of wood identifications. The aim of their work was first and foremost to enhance the archaeological record by identifying wood types, but then also to see if there is actually a correlation between artifact type and chosen raw material, as well as giving an insight into availability of different woods at the time. Wood identifications are often destructive, as illustrated here. One or more samples are being cut off the artifact and viewed at high magnification. This then shows the cell structure of the wood, which differs for different wood types. For sample taking, Zoe and I work closely together to ensure a representative amount of samples are taken per artifact group, but also that samples were taken from already damaged areas or areas that are not well visible, so sort of like hidden areas. Wood identifications are best undertaken before conservation, so I had to then consult with Zoe in terms of the conservation treatment schedule to make sure that before I put anything into active conservation, that Zoe had access to the wood first, and we could have a conversation about which artifact groups still needed to be sampled and how many of those and where best to take the samples. One large artifact category are the gunner's implements. So on this slide here, you have a selection of a lint stock up here, a handspike, a rammer head. Here is the one end of the lint stock that shows scorch marks, and down here we have a priming wire. And taken together, they can be used to illustrate naval warfare of the 17th century. This aspect has been worked on by Dan Pascoe and Alex Hildred. Now, let's look a bit closer at what Zoe found out about the gunner's implements. Fraxinus, so that is ash to you and me, is the dominant wood type used for gunner's implements. Ash is strong, but also elastic, and it has been used for making bows or tool handles or baseball bats. So we can immediately see how the natural properties of ash were exploited for items such as the handspikes, which would have to be very resilient when they were in use. But there are also two cases where destructive sampling was not appropriate. We have two rare and completely preserved finds from the London, a pipe stopper shown here on the left and the tuning peg of an instrument shown on the right. For those two artifacts, we decided not to take a sample, and we tried a different approach. We worked closely together with imaging specialists from the CT scan facilities at the University of Southampton, especially Katie Rankin. In collaboration with her, we developed a protocol for the non-destructive identification of wood using CT scanning. The results are extremely promising, and this work has since been submitted to a journal, and we are now waiting to hear back from the editors and hopefully soon going into the review process. We took a similar approach when it came to the silver coins. We had two lots of coins, affectionately called the large and the small lump. And as you can see, these were fused and concreted together. The coin identification and quantification work was done by Katie Marston, again in collaboration with the University of Southampton. And here you can see the large coin lump mounted in a container and then fixed to the sample stage. The X-ray source is on your left and the X-ray detector plate is on the right. And what was really interesting is that CT scanning did not just allow us a non-destructive quantification and analysis of the coins, it also gave some interesting insights into the preservation. Coins in the outer perimeters of both lumps actually were, generally speaking, easier to image. At these areas were less dense than the center of the coin lumps. However, the coins on the edges were not as well preserved as the coins in the center. So the coins on the edges had a higher degree or experienced a higher degree of corrosion, and especially the edges had suffered from this increased corrosion. This also confirmed that taking this non-destructive approach was the right decision, as physical separation of the coins would not only be very time consuming, but would also jeopardize information that is embedded in very soft corrosion products and can still be seen in the CT scan images, but would probably not survive conservation cleaning. The London project has provided numerous outreach and learning opportunities. This has ensured that interest in the project remained high, but also that the sector benefited from further development opportunities. Access to artifacts by various specialists is crucial to post-excavation work, and a carefully planned program of sample taking, analysis, and conservation was put in place to ensure a smooth workflow. This project has been coordinated by Cotswold Archaeology and involved Historic England, external and freelance specialists, as well as the licensing team for the London Rec and Southend Museum services. So what's left? Where next for the London project? The various specialists have submitted their contributions to a project monograph, which will summarize the project from recovery to results of the analysis. A number of papers have already or shortly will be published in specialist journals, and then we are still faced with the task of depositing the project archive. In the meantime, if you would like to find out more about the London, there is the project webpage and a contribution in the Historic England Research News magazine. Some results have already been published in the Historic England Research Report series, and those reports are available as a free PDF download from the Historic England webpage, or you can explore the dive trail. And of course, you can stay updated via the various social media channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for joining us from your home.
It's okay.
We do have a question from the audience, and I'm glad this question was asked because this is one of my questions too. I remember seeing, I wasn't there when it happened, but I remember seeing in the media, in print and on television, the gun carriage coming up. Is the gun carriage conservation with you as well?
No, it's not. That was a really large artifact. So, and simply speaking, our freeze dryer isn't big enough to accommodate an artifact of this size. So I did at one point offer we could take it all apart and I can deal with it in sections, but I think the decision was taken to leave it all together, and it was sent up to York to be conserved by York Archaeological Trust. But that piece is finished already, and I think it might be back in Southend, but we best ask Kira.
Well, she's actually just replied.
You know, with the
She's just replied. It is back from conservation and is in stores in Southend, and we hope to be able to put it on display in the future. Oh, I'm looking forward to Kira's presentation.
Yes.
So that would have been then. That would have been treated with PEG and then freeze dried.
Yeah, that's the normal procedure. So first of all, artifacts go through desalination. So from a marine environment, we normally have to wash out all these salts that have migrated into the many years of burial on the seabed. And then for wood, we normally do impregnation with a polymer PEG or polyethylene glycol, and then we vacuum freeze dry, and this normally results in sort of light wood, so light in terms of weight, but also the color is improved, so it has a much more natural look to it afterwards. So we're sort of moving away from the constant brown that we're normally dealing with when it comes down to organic materials in archaeology. Yeah,
I did like your comment of lots of different shades of brown.
Yes.
So archaeologists should always wear sort of project t-shirts that are brown because that's the color we're most used to dealing with.
Yeah,
Uh,
but that's, you know, then we get really excited when we do find a bit of color, like on that book cover. So it doesn't happen very often that we do come across, you know, any pigments or color remains. So, and it just shows that yeah, the past was really colorful. It's just that it doesn't really survive that well.
The level of preservation of the organics is down to the particular sediments.
Yes, so if I understand the site correctly, the the deeper sediment is clay, and then you have looser sediment sitting on top. But basically, like generally speaking, the less oxygen there is, the better for the preservation of all these organic materials. So the wood, the leather, the textiles, and water will exclude oxygen already, but if artifacts are buried in the seabed, that will exclude even more oxygen. And clay is just a fantastic material for that. It's really sticky, and hardly any air can get to it. So, but then as soon as artifacts are exposed and the oxygen levels rise, we have to then deal with marine wood borers, so which are especially keen on the many wooden artifacts that we find on the London, and we have seen evidence of wood borers and gribble and such things on the wooden artifacts.
Well, that sort of it hits home to the heart of the campaign to try to proactively
Yeah.
save things before they get exposed to the marine boring organisms. Janice has asked, is it the sea salt water destroying color? She knows that UV causes problems.
Yes, so UV, it depends a bit on the type of pigment and how it is fixed to the substrate, but I don't think it is the salt water specifically. I mean, it depends how the color, any sort of coloring medium was applied to the substrate. So if it's simply painted on, then it's sort of, you know, with the sort of erosion that you have going on, that can just eventually be just scoured and washed away. It's not the salt in the water as such, because we also don't find or the water itself, because we also don't find a lot of color on terrestrial land-based sites. So if you think back to all the lovely Greek marbles, you know, they all had loads of color on. It just sort of disappears, washes off. Yeah.
Yeah, it must be one of the first things to go. The coins, the metallurgy
Mm.
of the coins. Clearly, they're not gold because they're all concreted together into a lump.
Yes.
Does silver do that? Are they the silver?
Yeah, it's silver corrosion product. So it's mainly silver sulfide, and it just forms this sort of crust over it. But if you actually slice through, the image of the coins are still, you know, where it's left, it's still there, and based on that the identifications were undertaken. And silver corrosion products are very, very soft, so the yeah, but then the imprint is sort of left in that soft corrosion product, if you see what I mean. But they're so soft we can't sort of save them. It's like a powder, almost a compacted powder.
So silver coins that do survive and are, you know, conserved or can be conserved. Like, I mean,
Mm.
there's silver coins from the Rosevike, aren't there?
Yes.
So is the difference because of where it has found itself in touching other material, or is it because the quality of the silver?
It might be the quality of the silver, but also it might be. I mean, the Rosewijk is very different site conditions, so we haven't actually looked at the material composition of the London coins. So that's something we haven't done, because again, that would be, given that we can't actually get to them easily, we can't sort of discreetly just do a little scratch where we can get to the, yeah, to the actual coin. So we haven't looked at the composition for the London coins. I think the emphasis in this case was on quantifying, so seeing how many coins there are and then identifying them. And there were some really interesting results actually in there. So yeah, little pennies that were hidden between the bigger coins.
I know I've already asked you this question personally, and I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask it for the audience. In terms of the monograph, when might we hope to be able to learn about what all these specialists have been able to discover?
Oh, if you ask me, it can't be soon enough. It would be nice to be able to move along. So I suppose like a lot of projects, we've experienced the pandemic related delays. The monograph is currently with Cotswold Archaeology, and it's going through sort of the first editorial checking process. And then what normally happens is that it gets sent back, the draft text then gets sent back to all the co-authors to check again that their contributions have been reflected correctly and that no sort of mistakes or omissions have sort of crept in and all the rest of it. And then it will be off to the publishers. But I don't know. I'm not going to put a time scale on it, but because then But
no, yes, you'd be held to that. But let's
yes.
hope that that hopefully by the time we're, fingers crossed, able to meet again in March 2022, that actually some of the specialists might be able to present presentations on their finds, on their findings. Sorry. We have a question from Liz. Do you have any thoughts about who might have owned the shoe? Someone in the officer classes?
Yeah, so there are different types of shoes. There are no shoes that are associated with females. So we heard earlier that there were women on board and all the rest of it, but all the shoes to date are considered male shoes, despite the big heels on some of them and their slender shape, but that was the fashion at the time. There was a large group of shoes which are of more or less identical style and construction, and all the others that have a more individual style, and especially where the large stacked heel has survived, we assume that they would have belonged to a more higher ranking personnel on board, so like an officer or something. It's worth remembering that we did not have sort of uniform regulations at the time yet, so the fashion or the fashion items that you would find on a wreck of this time largely reflects the fashion of the common population, or like the population of the time as well, because people would literally bring with them what they owned and what they wore.
Yes, of course. I mean, you've got functionality, of course. You've got to wear it on a ship for months on end. But if you're actually not going to sea yet, and there's the regatta sort of thing going on, then who knows what people. How many shoes have you got? Do you know off the top of your head?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
It's quite a lot, isn't it? Considering how much has been excavated, there's actually a lot of shoes.
There's a lot of shoes. This is one for the leather and shoe specialist, Kita Mould. She's done a great piece of work, and her job was to sort of come up with a minimum number of securely identified shoes. And there's, of course, loads of fragments that you can't always associate with a complete shoe anymore. So yeah, no, I would have to go back to her report, but there are a lot of shoes.
Yeah, it's just like we've hit a department store, or a branch of Clark's for some reason, or we've just, I don't know, hit the bit of the ship where they were storing shoes, or I don't know what it is.
Yeah, there was this big, large lump with all the different, the similar styles and constructions.
Yeah, so Leon's sort of picked up on that. Do you think the shoes were actually being worn? Were there feet in these shoes? And the feet have unfortunately gone, and the shoes are left, or were these spares? Yeah, I don't know. There's a shoe that's got, is it right? There's a shoe that's got the imprint of somebody's foot. You can see it was a well-worn.
Yeah, I
as
haven't
in the
noticed
imprint of
any
their
sort of,
heel.
yeah, I mean, you would see sort of use wear and sort of, yeah, the imprints. Oh, I don't know. Again, I would have to go back to Kita's report. She has a much more trained eye to pick up those little details. I haven't seen any. Sometimes you find at the front of the shoe, at the toe cap, you find where the toe poked out, or people had foot complaints like a bunion or something like that.
Yeah.
Then people would cut the shoe open to accommodate the bunion and what have you. So we haven't got any such exciting things, but on one of the images of an insole I showed, there was a piece of textile actually attached to it. And whenever I come across textile, I get very excited because we know it would have been about in abundance, and all the clothing, there would have been sacks and the sailcloth and everything. But textile is so fragile in the water. It just rips and disintegrates and just floats away. So any bit of textile that we come across is hugely exciting for us, even if
Yeah.
it's just brown.
Okay, Angela, that's brilliant. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining
No,
us today and for
thank
sharing all
you.
of that. We look forward to the monograph at some point, and I definitely am looking forward to that gun carriage going on display, but maybe we'll hear more from Kira about that after the break.